Many in the international community believe that the West Bank is illegally occupied by the State of Israel. In this 7-part series, we examine this assumption and will determine what international law has to say in this regard. In addition to relying on relevant legal precedents, treaties, and customary international law, beginning with the formative historic events of the early 20th century, our analysis is based on the authoritative legal treaties on the subject, The Legal Foundation and Borders of Israel under International Law by legal scholar Howard Grief. In part 1 of this video series, we outline the legal foundation in international law underpinning Jewish sovereign rights and legal title not only to what is called the West Bank, but also to all the land of Israel, known in the founding legal documents as Palestine. Now, in part 2, we will briefly discuss the most important legal and political events that affected Palestine during the Mandate period. First, we will learn how the borders of the Jewish national home, that is, Palestine, were reduced, and second, we will learn about the catastrophic consequences of that reduction. One of the foundational legal documents we mentioned in part 1 was the Franco-British Boundary Convention of December 23, 1920. The importance of this treaty is that it defined the international border between Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. In actuality, however, the government of France prevented the northern and northeastern borders of Palestine from realizing its proper dimensions as defined by the San Remo Resolution. The French wanted the water resources in the north to go to Syria and the Lebanon, not to Palestine. Beside the fact that this was the first illegal reduction in the borders of Palestine, there was something positive about it. For the very first time in international law, the borders of Palestine explicitly included territory east of the Jordan River. Before we bring up the next map, study this map closely so that you will be able to see what happened to the borders of Palestine between December 1920 and February 1922, when the demarcation agreement was signed between the British and the French. Shocking, isn't it? Not only were the Golan Heights stripped away from Palestine and illegally given to Syria and the Lebanon, but all of Palestine east of the Jordan River, which now became known as Transjordan, was also torn away. How did this happen? First, the Council of the League of Nations illegally passed the British Transjordan Memorandum on September 16, 1922, to allow for the so-called temporary separate administration of Transjordan from the rest of Palestine. And by the way, this was the first time the term Transjordan was used and given a separate legal distinction. We will explain more about how this took place when we explain the background to what led up to this egregious action, but for now, we should at least know that there were at least 2 fundamental events that contributed to it. The addition of a new article, Article 25, to the draft mandate in August 1921, and the signing of the infamous Churchill White Paper on June 3, 1922, limiting Jewish immigration to the territory of Palestine west of the Jordan River. Second, a boundary commission was set up by the French and British governments with the noble goal to trace on the spot the boundary laid down under the Franco-British Boundary Convention of December 1920. However, when the British and French surveyors walked the ground to demark the boundary, they changed the boundary. And on February 3, 1922, this demarcation agreement was signed by both the British and French governments. However, for at least 3 reasons, it was illegal. First, The two countries were under a legal obligation, according to the San Remo Resolution, not to leave out of Palestine any territory, the so-called Dan to Beersheba formula, which we mentioned in the first video. Second, under the terms of the draft mandate that was being developed at that time, no territory of Palestine could legally be ceded to any other entity. And third, no modifications of the mandate could be made without the consent of the Council of the League of Nations, which in this specific case was not done. Let's now see the details of how Palestine had its borders reduced in so short a time, essentially between November 1920 and September 1923. The mandate for Palestine was approved by the British government in November 1920, and it was submitted to the Council of the League of Nations 1 month later in December. It could have been approved immediately, and if so, none of the border changes we've just outlined would have taken place. However, it wasn't approved by the Council of the League of Nations until July 1922, a year and a half later. Why was there such a delay? The governments of the United States and Italy both interfered in the approval process for their own self-interests. The U.S. government demanded to review all draft mandates due to corporate interests in exploiting petroleum and mineral resources in the Negev and the areas around the Dead Sea. And the Italian government pressed the French for assurances regarding its interests in southern Anatolia that might be prejudiced by the mandate for Syria and the Lebanon. Together, these actions created a delay in the approval process of the mandate that opened up a window of opportunity to change not only the mandate itself, but the borders of Palestine as well. Before we explain what took place during this year and a half, let's back up to set the stage. A monumentally important document had been signed as part of the Paris Peace Conference. On January 3rd, 1919, Emir Faisal, the third son of Hussein ibn Ali, the Grand Sheriff of Mecca, and Dr. Chaim Weizmann, who later became the president of the World Zionist Organization and eventually the first president of the State of Israel, co-signed what became known as the Weizmann-Faisal Agreement. This agreement explicitly stated that the two of them, as official representatives of the Jewish and Arab peoples, respectively, were mindful of the racial kinship and ancient bonds existing between them, and realizing that the surest means of working out the consummation of their national aspirations is through the closest possible collaboration in the development of the Arab state and Palestine. This quotation from the document proves that the Arab world knew and accepted that Palestine was being created after World War I to be the Jewish state in the Middle East. Further, in Article 3, it says, "All such measures shall be adopted as will afford the fullest guarantees for carrying into effect the British government's declaration of the 2nd of November 1917, which of course was the Balfour Declaration." Further, in Article 4 it says the following: "All necessary measures will be taken to encourage and stimulate immigration of Jews into Palestine on a large scale and as quickly as possible to settle Jewish immigrants upon the land." Now, as far as we know, this was the first and last time that an Arab leader publicly recognized the sovereign right of the Jewish state throughout all of Palestine. Now, we're able to answer the question of what happened between November 1920 and July 1922 that led to the changes in the mandate and in the borders of Palestine. In March 1920, Syria illegally declared independence and included Palestine in its declaration. And Faisal was proclaimed king of the Arab Kingdom of Syria. And this was after he had already signed the Weizmann-Faisal Agreement, agreeing to work with the Zionist organization to establish Palestine as the Jewish state in the Middle East. This declaration eventually led to war with France, and in July 1920, French forces removed Faisal's illegal government from Damascus. In response to his brother's defeat, Faisal's older brother, Abdullah, the second son of Hussein ibn Ali, invaded the area of Palestine east of the Jordan River, that's Transjordan, from the Hejaz, threatened France, and in March 1921 entered Amman and unilaterally and illegally created a de facto Transjordan government. It should be noted that both of these actions by Arab leaders constituted an Arab repudiation of the entire mandate system under which the Arabs were given Mesopotamia, Syria, and Lebanon. Not wanting to get into a fight with France, Churchill acquiesced to Abdullah's aggression and in the same month provisionally excluded Transjordan by making it a so-called Arab province of Palestine. The following month, the British made Abdullah administrator over eastern Palestine, Transjordan, and as stated earlier, in September 1922, the British government submitted a memorandum temporarily severing Transjordan from Palestine. To appease the Arabs even further and to justify the administrative separation of Transjordan to Abdullah in April 1921, the British government modified the draft mandate by adding a new article, which became known as Article 25. Article 25 states, "In the territories lying between the Jordan and the eastern boundary of Palestine as ultimately determined, the mandatory shall be entitled, with the consent of the Council of the League of Nations, to postpone or withhold application of such provisions of this mandate as he may consider inapplicable to the existing local conditions, and to make such provision for the administration of the territories as he may consider suitable to those conditions." First of all, it's worth noting that Article 25 acknowledges that the borders of Palestine actually do extend east of the Jordan River. Second, the British government did not have authority to permanently ignore key provisions of the mandate. This provision allowed for only a temporary suspension based on certain conditions. And third, these conditions were never specified. Now let's enumerate various articles of the mandate which Article 25 blatantly violated. It violated the second recital, to establish the Jewish national home in Palestine. The third recital, to recognize the historical connection of the Jewish people to Palestine. Article 2, to implement effective conditions to establish the Jewish national home. Article 4, to guarantee the Jewish agency's role in administering Palestine. Article 5, not to partition or cede Palestinian territory. Article 6, to facilitate Jewish immigration and settlement throughout Palestine. And Article 15, not to discriminate based on race, religion, or language. All of this smoke and mirrors led to the infamous Churchill White Paper, which we mentioned earlier, of June 3, 1922. In 1920, Herbert Samuel was appointed by British Prime Minister David Lloyd George to be the first High Commissioner of Palestine. And in 1921, Winston Churchill was appointed Colonial Secretary. Together, they redefined the Jewish national home in Palestine to mean a Jewish national home in part of Palestine. They changed the responsibility from establishing a Jewish commonwealth to developing only the cultural or spiritual life of the existing Jewish community. Zionist organizations would no longer share in the administration of Palestine. Transjordan would be excluded, and Jewish immigration in Western Palestine would be severely restricted. The British government's actions exhibited what is known in law as malfeasance, which is a hostile, aggressive action taken to injure the interests of the client, which in this case was the Jewish people. To make matters even worse, the British government exacerbated the problem by further illegal actions in 1928 and 1946. On September 16, 1922, the League Council illegally passed the British Transjordan Memorandum, allowing for the administrative separation of Transjordan from Palestine. And then, on February 20th, 1928, Great Britain signed the Anglo-Jordan Agreement, transferring administrative and legislative powers to Abdullah, violating the basic legal principle delegatus non potest delegare, meaning a delegate cannot delegate. Finally, on March 22nd, 1946, after World War II was finished, Great Britain signed the Treaty of London with Transjordan, officially severing it from Palestine and acknowledging the sovereignty and independence of Transjordan, violating at least Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations, the San Remo Resolution, Articles 2, 5, and 25 of the Mandate for Palestine, the Boundary Convention of 1920, the Anglo-American Convention of 1924, and Article 80 of the UN Charter. Before we conclude Part 2 of this video series, it should be pointed out that the British government's malfeasance toward the Jewish people had tremendous geopolitical repercussions, three of which we'll mention here. First, the attempted partitioning of Palestine, or the land of Israel, in 1947 by the nations of the world under the auspices of the United Nations, which we will discuss in future videos, would not have been so easily justified without these illegal precedents of the British government. Second, the Jewish state would have arisen much sooner than it did, and as a result, the Holocaust would not have been nearly as horrific as it was. In conclusion, we see that the Mandate period was fraught with tension and political intrigue that collectively worked against the Jewish people and against their sovereign rights in international law to the land of Israel, or Palestine, as it was then referred to in the international legal documents of the time. In Part 3 of this video series, we will focus on the important events that took place in Palestine after the Mandate period.